Today in the Hobby Bench, I'm going to be talking about priming your miniatures. So flat out what you need to do is you need to prime your miniatures. Paint really is not made to adhere to different surfaces and retain and stay on that. Typically they need to be aided somehow. That's what primers are for. Primers specifically have substances in it that help bond to different surfaces like plastic or metal. And then they'll provide a surface then that the paint can adhere to better. And you're going to get better coverage for painting. It's just going to be, let's say, more of a uniform color. So you need to prime your miniatures. Now, what kind of primer can you use? Well, flat out, I typically use, it's just, your basic hardware type primers. You can use more fancy primers, more fancy spray-on ones, maybe for miniatures and stuff like that. Trust me, honestly, like, Krylon, Rust-Oleum, like these basic primers that you can get at hardware stores, they work perfect for that. So one careful thing I would say though is that you do when you're buying this stuff is try to avoid stuff that has extra pigmentation on this one. This one here has, a lot more pigmentation. It's a lot more paint. It's useful and you can do that, bonds of plastic and stuff like that. But you'll find for some of these miniatures is that they may, if you spray too close up, it can fill in some detail and you can really sort of lose some detail on the miniatures in doing that. This kind of stuff though, honestly, this is really good if you're into 3D printing. Sometimes resin prints that you can get that can have like, let's say little lines and stuff of that sort. You can barely see that in here. This stuff here is great because it will help fill that in. And so like for terrain and stuff like that, if you print out, do a lot of 3D printer, this type of primers that have a little bit more pigmentation on it, these things are great to use. I'd also recommend is getting some brush on primer. And this is good sometimes, let's say if the weather's bad, it's this really inclement weather, it's really cold a lot, and you really need to get some painting done and you don't have a way of using a primer, this is great stuff to have. Also, what's great about this brush on primer, this type of stuff, and this is one specifically I get from Army Painter. You can buy them also, I think, from Vallejo and some other manufacturers. Is, if you're spraying it on, you may have some areas that, let's say, you missed. And so you can always go ahead and use this brush on primer, just thin it down with a little bit of water, and you can just touch up those areas that you miss. You don't have to go out and just try to spray it all over again. So for using your primers and using this, all you have to do is have it inverted. You want to shake it, get that ball moving. And literally you do want to do this for about a minute, maybe 2 minutes. You really need to get that mixed up. When you're priming, I want to try to do it on days that necessarily aren't too cold, where you have the can a little bit and just warm that up. And so, spraying in really cold weather, you're going to have some issues with the accelerant and getting an uneven distribution of the paint, and it's not going to really work out too well. So you definitely just don't want to do it on really cold days. Now for priming your miniature, some people put it on a box and work with it. What I really recommend is using paint sticks. And again, this is something that you can get at a hardware store. And what I use is you can just get some blue tack. This is stuff that goes up. It's this simple adhesive putty. This is stuff that you can mount, let's say, posters on a wall. And it's made to be tacky, but it's not going to be a permanent putty. You can just peel that off and work with that. And so you can basically put that down in your base. And the idea then is you have a stick there. So as you're spraying, you can go ahead and get a good distance in this and get a bunch of different angles, and you can hold it upside down. And this is a great way of working with it. If you paint with 15 millimeter miniatures, a good thing to use is what I like to use is these popsicle sticks. And then you can just use basically PVA glue, just Elmer's glue, and you can glue your miniatures down on them. And then this is a great way to have that. You can use that for priming and also for painting. That's a great way of having that. You don't necessarily have to try to finagle handling that just by a small miniature base. So these, if you do 15 millimeter, popsicle sticks are great. And a special mention to Reaper Bones. These miniatures have a plastic that is really set up that it doesn't need to be primed. But what I found typically is that you probably do want to use a little bit of primer. And I would recommend using maybe the brush on primer for this. but really have it thinned down quite a bit. And just, that helps just give a little bit more of a surface for the paint to adhere to. These work pretty well without priming, using a primer, but I found that, actually you're going to get some spots that might be a little hydrophobic, and this may not necessarily have a hard time getting some coverage over it. So having just a base coat of primer really helps out. I don't think that you necessarily need to have, something, a complete coat sprayed on, but for sure using a brush primer, that helps. Just a really thin coat. A good way of getting a shortcut with some of your miniatures is to use a base coat of a specific color. I have the Stormtroopers here. I pretty much go ahead and used a white primer for this one, a white matte primer, because they're going to be white. So this is a good way to get most of that base coat down. I can just usually touch up a couple little areas between the joints and stuff like that. And then it's a white color that I can match with and go over and paint. That can save me a little time. I also got World War II German here. This is an Afrika Korps German. And I sprayed them up with a tan. That's going to be, for most of the uniform, that's going to be used. Also for the base, it's textured, and I've already sprayed that out. So, like the base is pretty much done. I'm just going to have to dry brush it a little bit. And so I'm just going to go through and pick out some details and stuff. But, most of his uniform is sort of done. Sometimes you can use some colored primers to provide that initial base coat for a lot of your stuff and save you a little bit of time. Now, the question is what color do you use? A lot of folks use black primer, and I don't really like using that. I typically find that using gray primer is a good neutral color. It's, dark enough to not be so transparent when you're painting on some darker shades, let's say some browns or greens, that kind of thing. It leaves a good foundation for a color for that. But it's also not so dark that if you're using brighter colors, it's going to bleed through and you're basically going to see that blackness underneath it. It sort of depends on what you're painting, but I think if you're in a pinch and you're really not too sure, you're a little tight in a budget, gray is a good all-around primer to use. Now, there is a way of maybe speeding up your painting a little bit. One trick is to use a black primer. Then what you're going to use is what they call Zenithal highlights. So you're going to prime it black, and then you're going to get a white primer. And the idea is that you're going to hold the miniature and spray from the top down. And the idea then is that you're going to have areas here that will catch the light, and that's going to be white. And then the other areas that are underneath it are going to be darker. And so that'll allow some initial shade. So as you're painting over your base coats, or even just, some more of your highlights and washes, that'll add some transition to the color, and it's a little bit easier to work with. Some folks really like doing that with contrast paints quite a bit. But, that's a lot of work. If you really want to cut corners a little bit, I just recommend using a gray primer initially, and then you can work on your base coats and do that. You will see here for some of the contrast paints that I do here that, I've painted this up gray, but then I've gone back and dry brushed this really quite a bit with white. Even for skin tones, I touched that just with a white. And so this is another way of doing the same thing with the Zenithal highlights a little bit. It's just doing a little bit more manual work there, just doing some dry brushing. But that's what some folks use. I think you can get away with it with just using regular primer. So in conclusion, again, for sure, these bare metal miniatures, you don't want to put paint on that. You've got to prime that first. I recommend getting some spray primers that you can get at the hardware store. There's different brands like Krylon, for example, or for Rust-Oleum. I sort of like using those. You definitely want to consider maybe getting a brush arm primer. That'll help if you have any touch-ups. Sometimes you can use colored primers to sort of help, maybe with a base coat for some of your miniatures and sort of speed up that process a little bit. But for the most part, I just recommend just using a good spray primer. Make sure you mix it well, prime miniatures, and let them dry. Wait a couple hours, wait overnight, it's even better. And that's about it. So next time I'm going to be going on maybe some other things that you'll need for painting and going a little bit more on paints and on brushes.